said, "What is history?" And he said, "History is an angel being blown backwards into the future."
A professor at the University of Florida claims that the meaning of the greatest play in the English language, Edward de Vere's Hamlet, is this hole in the ground in Gainesville, Florida. Believe it or not. Let's see for ourselves what lies at the bottom of these stairs.
My seminars for the past several years have been working on the relationship between literacy and television. We found that this relationship was best articulated by the people who were critical of television. In fact, we had to learn how to read televisually in the same way that people used to have to learn about heresy by reading the refutations made of it by the church fathers.
The Voices and Visions episode of the Annenberg CPP project was a big influence on Ulmer's thinking. Although the publicity promised that the programs would be about the poems, in fact the programs were more about the poets' lives and had more to do with biography than anything else. Well, what struck Ulmer about this was during the 13 installments of the program, even when the experts seemed to be suggesting otherwise, the program consistently focused on places where the poems were written or places where the authors came from. I think that was one of the bigger turning points in his thinking.
There's something intensely secretive about Stevens. One doesn't know. I don't, it's hard, the disclosures in Stevens are not of the most, not of the primary sort. He never says, "I am feeling bad today." It's not that way at all.
The only image we have of Emily Dickinson is a daguerreotype that she sat for in 1848 as a student at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary.
I think there's something else that needs to be mentioned. In terms of the places that were used, the places became the ground of meaning. What we were interested in was, how does the camera represent literature? That is, how can you use cameras to represent what's in a poem? Over and over again, the camera seemed to be pointing to the fact that the places used referred to the poem. Whether in fact they did or not didn't matter. I think this was crucial for Ulmer's thinking on Hamlet.
Count about 10 before you start.
If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story.
Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, knew that the dead must rely on the living to tell their stories. This film is about the man who wrote Hamlet. But whose story are we supposed to tell?
There have been several great moments in the history of television, moments or events of reading televisually that have actually gotten onto broadcast television. I'm not thinking of video art, things like John Cage, his Mesostics on Finnegan's Wake, or Gary Hill's reading of Blanchot in Incidents of Catastrophe. But things like, even if it is on PBS, something like the Alive from Off-Center program when Laurie Anderson sang Walter Benjamin's 9th thesis on the philosophy of history.
What is history? And he said, history is an angel being blown backwards into the future. He said, history is a pile of debris, and the angel wants to go back and fix things, to repair things that have been broken. But there is a storm blowing from paradise, and the storm keeps blowing the angel backwards into the future. And this storm is called progress.
Roman Jakobson, in his famous paper on 2 types of aphasic disturbances, divided all literature into 2 categories, according to whether work favored figures of similarity, metaphor, or figures of contiguity, metonymy. Jakobson suggested that, in the same way that individuals with brain lesions often display a loss of one or the other of these figurative abilities, the literary scholars, as a group, display a contiguity disorder, writing as they do almost exclusively about metaphor. Ulmer began to suspect just the opposite disorder in Voices and Visions, which seemed to be treating the most metaphorical of literary forms in an exclusively metonymic fashion, in the manner of a realism that always digresses from character to setting in time and space.
Suddenly, the bus driver stops with a jolt, turns off his lights. A moose has come out of the impenetrable wood and stands there, looms rather, in the middle of the road. It approaches. It sniffs at the bus's hot hood. Towering, antlerless, it's a female. High as a church, homely as a house, or safe as houses. Taking her time, she looks the bus over, grand, otherworldly.
The visual tracks of the programs, rightly heralded as the most sophisticated representation of poetry ever attempted in television, were systematically committed to a literal interpretation of the poem. No matter that the language of the poem might represent a barrage of literary figurative language, the visual track always focused on the place and ignored all the other vehicles. The poems were all read literally, taken literally.
He was a poet and a leader of an artistic movement called Dada. A hat like this was part of his costume, which looked like this. The number 13 on the cardboard tube that covered his face had nothing or everything to do with his performance. Dada artists didn't claim to make sense, but they did want to make unconventional artistic statements, most of them as a form of social protest. In this case, the statement included waving a small flag while reciting a nonsensical poem. The poem was written and first performed by Hugo Ball in Zurich in 1916. And it remains to this day a classic example of what Mr. Ball called sound poetry. Here's what it sounds like. a totally imaginary language invented by Mr. Ball. Kawani jolifanto blumba ofali hambla. Grossiga me pafla habla hormi gaga gorman. High globlo ikora sula huju. Holaka holala. And logobang, blagobang baso futaka. Ooh. Shampa uwala wasa. Olobo. Hechtada gora message zumbada. Wulubu susuba de uluwa susuba de tamba. Baumf. Kasagama. Baumf. It didn't make any sense, but it wasn't supposed to make any sense.
In trying to understand the strange literalisms in the Voices and Visions filming, Ulmer thought he saw a clue in the movie biography of the Osmond family, Side by Side, where Marie Osmond plays the part of her mother, Olive, in scenes charged with edible tension. The Osmond family's story, with Marie as Olive giving birth to herself, teaching herself to sing and dance, constituted a fantasy of narcissistic paranoia for which her reading of the Hugo Ball sound poem was a symptom, the sound poem being the literalization of poetry to its vocal material. Ulmer generalized from this example.
Now I'm going to ignore that crack about Edward de Vere and just chalk it up to the arrogance of interviewers and simply point out to you that Freud, in his analysis of the play, linked Hamlet with Oedipus. And I think here's the key to Ulmer's interest in Hamlet, his own problems dealing with the death of his father, who was named, by the way, incidentally, Walter.
Walter Annenberg's career can be seen in this context: his drive to succeed, his obsession with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and his eventual appointment by Richard Nixon as ambassador to England, home of the great bard Edward de Vere, were motivated by a desire to legitimize the reputation of his family, particularly his father, who had made his fortune selling racetrack information to bookies in illegal gambling parlors.
Now, Walter Ulmer operated a sand and gravel plant in Montana, where Ulmer himself grew up. And he has retrospectively linked that plant with Hamlet's Mill, which of course looks back to the original Hamlet, or Amlodi, who, as the Norse legend has it, operated a mill which during Amlodi's lifetime ground out peace and plenty. But upon his death, the plant degenerated to grinding out nothing but salt. And as the ages pass, the plant itself literally sunk to the bottom of the sea, where it was reduced to grinding out rock and gravel. And as it did so, it created a tremendous whirlpool or maelstrom, and the legend holds that that whirlpool led the way to the land of the dead. Now, the various cycles of Hamlet's Mill correspond to that astronomical cosmology in which the sun, as it shifts through the various phases of the zodiac, determines the successive ages of man, as we move, for example, from the age of the literate to the age of the heroic, finally to the electronic age.
I noticed a certain bias favoring literalism in the reading that was explicitly taught on television, as opposed to the associative slide that television taught implicitly. A good example of the way this instruction works with a negative instruction in how to read associatively may be seen in Paper Tiger television.
Like it is, turns out something more like a dream than reality. There's a sort of dream logic at work, isn't there? A US spy story in Moscow, followed by a British spy who spied for the other side, followed by the El Salvador story. What links these three things? Well, they're all about commies, one way or another. It's like a classic example of a non-narrative, you know, at one level. You know, the sort of story that says, Mary has a little lamb, lambs come from New Zealand was discovered by Captain Cook, cooks are always male, unless they're housewives. That sort of logic. But at another level, there's a considerable logic at stake. The cohesiveness of putting three stories about communists together, pigeonholing them, organizing the very few 14, 15, 20 stories they tell us in these broadcasts, organizing those stories in this way is really the most important job they do.
What's at stake in this kind of problem may be seen in what is perhaps the most significant, the most important treatment of reading yet produced for television, the Frontline program on Mark Chapman, who explained his murder of Lenin, the songwriter, not the Russian, as an interpretation of Salinger's Catcher in the Rye.
If a body meet a body coming through the rye were the first words of Robert Burns' famous 18th century song. But in the novel The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield is spellbound by a young child singing, "If a body catch a body coming through the rye." It's that misunderstanding that gives Holden an image of himself, an explanation for why adults become phonies, and why innocent children need a catcher in the rye.
Holden sees himself standing on the edge of a cliff and stopping children from accidentally falling over. The cliff is symbolic, or rather the falling of a child is symbolic of the transference from adolescence to adulthood. When a child falls off the cliff, he becomes an adult. 9 times out of 10, he becomes a phony. Holden doesn't want to see that. He wants to see the whole world full of nothing but children, non-phonies. And he wants to catch them and keep them. But you see, what happens to Holden is he does fall off the cliff. He does fall. And that's what's happened to me. I will never hit bottom. Never. I'll just keep falling and falling and falling. I fell off the cliff, but I never did become an adult.
On October 23, 1980, Mark Chapman signed his timesheet, John Lennon.
Chapman is a projective reader, which is to say someone who uses literature to solve the problems of everyday life. Unfortunately, his problem was that John Lennon had written Chapman's songs. Now, what is the lesson of this example? Why is this the example of projective reading that we see on TV? It's a warning. The consequences of projective reading are murder, death, madness, tragedy. And the antidote for this terrible fate, the solution, may be seen in its alternative, the literalism offered by Voices and Visions, in which meaning is simply the place where the poet happens to live. This is the phobia that Derrida called logocentrism. This is a phobia that goes back to Plato, who warned of the democratic consequences of allowing readings to circulate in the world without their authors present to explain them.
In fact, the Chapman case supports Ulmer's theory of the literalism to which Voices, Visions, and Frontline restricts reading with its explicit message about literalism. Chapman was a celebrity stalker, and he's a classic case of what the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan called paranoia, something that might be to our day what hysteria was to Freud's day. In 1932, Jacques Lacan wrote a thesis on what has come to be called the Aimé case. And in that famous murder case, a woman named Aimé attacked an actress. Now this paranoia amounts to what one has, I think Ulmer has called felicitously, a metaphor disorder. The loss of figurative ability, a literalization of metaphor into metonymy up to the point that the figure enters the real. Instead of being content to simply say, I'll scratch her eyes out, to mean I'd like to be her. And if we want to get more complex about the repressed homoeroticism in I really love her, the woman, Aimé, literally attacked the eyes of the other woman with whom she identified, wanting to kill her and wanting to be her. This applies to Chapman and his relationship to John Lennon as well. For there to be a paranoid crime, a metaphor and for Lacan, a metaphor is the ego, must collapse. In Chapman's case, one metaphor that catalyzed his collapse of his ego, his break with reality, was Catcher in the Rye.
Now, Ulmer's interest in Hamlet's Mill, of course, is inseparable from his interest in his father's gravel plant in Montana, because, of course, that gravel plant was a series of screens of different sizes through which gravel and rock passed, and which was in turn sifted out, categorized. In other words, for me, Ulmer's interest in Hamlet's Mill is really his way of returning to his father, in fact, of atoning for leaving that literal physical work of his father and becoming an intellectual. The mill becomes a way of his return to his roots. And there's one more extraordinary thing. Hamlet's Mill, it was said in legend, was built upon a plug, the removal of which would lead to a flood, a catastrophe, the removal of which, in effect, created a sinkhole.
Although folks in the South are praying for the drought to end, geologists warn that wetter weather could cause a significant number of sinkholes. CNN's John Zarella has our science report.
Sinkholes are a prevalent, dangerous reality in the southeastern United States, particularly north-central Florida. Without warning, the earth can give way, swallowing up cars, devouring homes, and making sections of highways disappear. Geologists at the University of Florida now say that if heavy rains should follow the drought in the southeast, a greater than normal number of sinkholes could develop.
I would suspect that you'll see a rash of sinkholes developing just as soon as we begin a major rainy season.
The reason, according to Randazzo, is a geological process called wash-ins. During a drought, these wash-ins can be caused in two different ways. A cavity or open space below the surface may have been filled with water before the drought. This water helps support the roof, but during a drought, the water dries up or is pumped out.
The result is a loss of buoyancy, and this loss of buoyancy has the effect of reducing the total strength of the rocks and its ability to support a roof or ceiling, which results in the collapse of that ceiling.
In other words, the roof washes in because there's nothing to support it. Randazzo believes the southeast has already experienced most of this type of drought-related wash-in. The next rash of sinkholes will come when heavy rains saturate the ground and wash in the sand and clay, covering the empty cavities in the earth. But Randazzo and his colleague, Doug Smith, say the danger from sinkholes can be avoided. They have developed a method of detecting where sinkholes might occur.
Geology is one of the sciences that the inventors of structuralism used, as did Marxists, anthropologists, psychoanalysis, to devise their theories of structure. Now, it just so happens that the sinkhole is a very good image for Lacan, the French psychoanalyst's concept of foreclosure. Now, Lacan had a whole other image other than the sinkhole, which is Greg Ulmer's image. Lacan had the image for repression of a piece of fabric with a hole torn in it. Now, the foreclosure that would cause paranoia is not at all a matter of having a tear in a piece of fabric. It's really much more like a sinkhole. Actually like the sinkhole at Devil's Millhopper, where you have a deep hole covering rocks underneath the hole. So this is foreclosure. So what happens in paranoia, what happens in what one would call this kind of metaphor disorder, is that these rocks get split off from reality. And when the rocks are split off from reality, covered by the sinkhole, everybody thinks everything's just fine. You can be literal, nothing's going to happen, no rock is going to come back and hit you over the head. So what they're not dealing with in not looking at Devil's Millhopper as a very serious matter is that the foreclosure of figurative thinking in America is itself a metaphor for the foreclosure of paranoia.
Now that we've finally gotten to the bottom of this sinkhole, have we fathomed the significance of this strange case of hermeneutics? What is the distance between the general and the particular in this nested allegorical reading that Professor Ulmer learned from television? Is it that, like Oedipus and Hamlet, they learned they were responsible for their own circumstances, and Professor Ulmer has learned that he's the link between Hamlet and this sinkhole? Or is it, as William Bennett said, quoting George Orwell, that there is no nonsense so ridiculous that some professor won't believe it? What strange slippage led this professor to believe that because a work of art is affected by the conditions in which it's composed, the meaning that the reader can get out of it is likewise affected by those conditions? If paranoia occurs when metaphor enters reality, what happens when metonymy does the same? Yet Ulmer claims that he learned from voices and visions that the distance between Hamlet and this sinkhole is 2.5 miles, and the distance from here to his house is 2.5 miles. Believe it or not. I can't believe I've got to walk up all these stairs.
She said, what is history? And he said, history is an angel being blown backwards into the future. He said, history is a part of debris, and the angel wants to go back and fix things, to repair the things that are broken. But there is a storm blowing from past, and the storm keeps blowing.